Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us in the Midwest, at least. It's kind of a dreary Thursday in December, but we are excited to bring this body of work to you. We have over 150 people registered from all over the country, so we're super excited. And let me start by saying that I'm not Teresa Hawley, who was advertised to be hosting this webinar, but unfortunately she had a personal emergency. And so I am Sessy Nyman. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center for Early Learning Funding Equity, and we're thrilled that you could join us today. We're going to cover a lot of information. This is one of a series of 3 webinars that we're going to do because there is so much rich data that we want to dig into in this Shortchanged project that we decided to break it up. But this one, we're thrilled to have Allison Friedman-Krause from NIEER, the National Institute of Early Education Research at Rutgers University. She is the Associate Research Professor at NIEER, where she leads NIEER's policy research team on their state report card. I'll talk a little bit in our reflections, but I remember when the first report card came out, and I'll share a little bit about what that meant for me as a lobbyist in the state of Illinois, in the state legislature, and how that really kind of was a game changer for us. So we're thrilled to have Allison. So the work that she does at NIEER really she leans on her experience and training as a developmental psychologist and research analysis, data analysis, to really bring such incredibly important work and findings and information to the early care and education field. So we're really grateful for our partnership with NIEER. We would still be slogging away trying to understand and collect data and clean data had it not been for the work that NIEER has been doing for over 2 decades on the preschool side. So we're thrilled to have Allison. And then my colleague Sarah Van Valkenburg is here. She was going to help us with some questions towards the end and help monitor the chat. And so please, we encourage you as the conversation moves forward, put your questions in the chat, comments in the chat. We want to hear from you. We want this to be as helpful to everybody listening, and we also always look forward to learning from our audience. And finally, Michelle Bizark is going to walk us through the work today. She is a senior policy research associate or analyst at CELFE. She has led the Shortchanged project and is really going to walk us through the work that has been going on for over 2 years in terms of getting us to where we are today. Michelle's work is she's a researcher and in early care and education, in really government systems, in administration. She's been published in multiple places, Time and the Washington Post and the Journal for Policy History, and we're really excited for her. Her new book by Cambridge University Press is coming out in May of 2026, Making Babies Count. So we'll look forward for that, and we'll probably be celebrating that when it hits the streets in the spring of 26. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who's going to walk us through the work that she's been leading and that CELFE is very proud to contribute to the early care and education field.
Thank you, Sessy. And hello, everybody. We are so excited that so many of you could join us during what we know is an extremely busy time of year. So we have some really interesting findings from our Early Learning Shortchanged project, and we're really eager to dig into them. Now, we've released a new report this week, which we hope you'll read and share. Maggie will link to that in the chat at the end of our conversation. But first, we should start, and I should explain what is the Early Learning Shortchanged project. So we know in the United States that we invest the least in children when it counts the most in the early years. And at CELFE, we decided that we wanted to track public investments in education and care across different age groups and across funding sources. And we really wanted to do this so that policymakers, advocates, and researchers have more accurate tools that they can use at their disposal. So now we know at CELFE that children need a wide variety of supports in order to thrive, but we really focus on early care and education. So that means childcare, preschool, Head Start, and then early intervention and special education for preschoolers, and then home visiting and parent education for children birth to kindergarten entry. So we consider these programs together because they make up what we think of as the early care and education system, but in reality, this system is extremely fractured, which makes tracking public investments very difficult. So unlike the K-12 system, where federal and state and local spending are pretty well documented, or at least they historically have been through the Department of Education, jury is out on how well they'll document it into the future. But early care and education, on the other hand, doesn't have a single federal reporting system. And there are very few states that really comprehensively report their spending across the different funding streams. So at the federal level, we're considering all 12 of the programs over to the left of this slide as part of the ECE funding system, which is quite complicated in and of itself. But things get even more complicated when we get to the state level. So here's one example of what I mean when I say it gets complicated. We affectionately call this slide our spaghetti map. And we love it because it shows just how many different agencies ECE funding needs to get through in order to reach children. So this is an example from our home state of Illinois, and which we know the state is actually working very hard as we speak to simplify this. But as you can imagine, every single state has its own unique spaghetti map. And so that's what my team was tasked with setting out to go track and find. So this makes tracking public investments across every single state really challenging. Within each state, ECE programs often sit across multiple different agencies, and expenditure budgets are pretty rarely publicly available. And even when they are, states often don't break out expenditures down by program. So it's a bear, but we did it. For the better part of a year, my team has been tracking down. And what I mean by tracking down is like we locate all the multiple different expenditure budgets from multiple agencies in each state. We then comb through them line by line. Sometimes that means we have to find the right contact in each state in order to, when information is either unclear or unavailable. And then, we've also resorted to making public record requests when all else has failed. So once we did all of that, we then categorize programs and then analyze both federal and ECE expenditure data. And so Allison will tell you about how NIEER tracks state public preschool investments. And we use their data in our analysis. We lean on it really heavily, as Sessy mentioned. But we also found that most states are actually spending significantly more on childcare, early intervention, and home visiting than is captured in national reporting. Okay, so what do I mean when I say national reporting? I mean the federal funding for ECE, like Head Start and Early Head Start. I mean IDEA Part B and C and McV. And then I also mean state reported matches for and maintenances of effort for programs like CCDF and TANF. And then finally, of course, the really critical data that NIEER collects on state and local preschool investments. So this is one example from our friends in the state of Maine of why it's so important to go directly to state expenditures. So by going directly to Maine state expenditures, we were able to find that Maine spent 37% more than is captured in national reporting. We also know, because we've been working with the state for the last 2 years, that Maine has invested, at historic level in their early childhood workforce in the last since FY22. So, that's why it's so important that we continue to update this analysis annually, and so that we can really track how this funding and investments ebb and flow in order to create this an historical record. We also found that Maine is far from alone in this trend. So nationally, when we looked across every single state, we found that states are spending $6.7 billion more than was captured in national reporting. So that's a pretty hefty chunk of change. We also found that 18 states spent more than the required CCDF MOE and match on childcare. And we found all but 3 states are spending significantly more than is nationally reported. So New Mexico is a state that we hear about a lot in early childhood as really being a leader at the forefront of state investments. Missouri, on the other hand, is not. And yet we found that Missouri spent 47% more than was captured in national reporting. And again, Massachusetts and Utah are not states that you often hear in the same sentence in early care and education, but both spent 28% more. And this is true across the country. So in addition to all of that research, we also wanted to dig deeper to understand how public dollars are being invested across age groups for this project. So here we disaggregate funding streams across 3 different age groups: infants and toddlers, preschoolers, and then kids once they enter the school-age children. Some of the funding streams that we analyze are age specific, so that makes our math relatively easy, and then others serve multiple different age groups. So we've come up with calculations for how we disaggregate those funding streams, and you can read more about our methods in our reports if you're interested. So here's kind of the headline slide. Nationally, we find that we invest 84% less in children before they enter kindergarten than after. And what I think is really interesting and clear from this graph is how dependent early care and education is nationally on federal dollars. So when you look at all the national averages, you see that federal investments are relatively even, or they're relatively consistent across age groups, and really where the major gap is in state and local investments. But of course, we wanted to dig even deeper than national averages, and we ran this analysis in every single state. And as you can imagine, public investments in EC look very, very different across states. So while the $6.7 billion that in additional state investments that we found in our digging is very encouraging, our analysis shows that even when we account for this even when we account for all those extra state dollars, states are still significantly underinvesting in their youngest learners, and this is particularly true for infants and toddlers. So, for example, we found that only Illinois, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania contributed more state revenue to infant and toddler care and education than came from federal funding sources. All other states are really heavily reliant on federal investments in this age group. And I think what's really interesting in this chart over here is that federal and state and local investments in infants and toddlers and kids once they enter the K-12 system are nearly the inverse of one another, while preschool investments are much more evenly split across different funding sources. And you can see the complete chart. You can see this complete table in our report. So in order to account for variations in population size and cost of living and political and social context needs each state, every state has a different context that they're operating in, and it's not fair to compare states across. Given all of that different variation, we use per capita K-12 investments, so the number of children in each of these birth cohorts in each state, as our analytical benchmark for ECE. So this is not at all meant to be a commentary on how much the amount that each state is spending on children in the K-12 system. So in no way do we want to be understood as saying that the bars over to the right should be lower. But it is this really helpful analytical tool because it allows us to rank each state's relative investment in ECE by considering the ratio between state and local investments in younger children and in older children. So I picked these 2 states because I think they give kind of an illustrative example of just how much variation there is in terms of how much states are investing in different age groups. So Pennsylvania and Vermont are both ranked within the top 10 states in terms of how much they're investing in their early childhood systems. However, you can see that Vermont is spending significantly more on preschoolers than on infants and toddlers, while Pennsylvania is spending relatively consistently across infants and toddlers and preschoolers. So we've done this analysis in every state, and we've ranked the states accordingly. So this we've call our mountain graph because you can see the peaks and valleys of different age groups and where states are investing. The red dotted line shows the total ratio per capita birth to K entry investments compared to school age investments. And I think, we just find this fascinating of where the different peaks and valleys are in each state. So again, you can find more, you can gaze upon this in our report. So you can find all of this information on our website as well. We really wanted this research to not only be an interesting report, but also to be really usable information for policymakers and for advocates in the field. So we built this website with that in mind. It has this interactive map feature, which allows you to compare investments across states. You can also, of course, find our reports, and then we also have links to NIEER State of Preschool, of course, the Children's Funding Project, fiscal maps, and the Xant's Navigator, because really these tools are all meant to complement one another. So on the website, when you hover over a state, you can click on each state and you can view this double-sided fact sheet, which is really intended for advocates and legislators, or really any interested party. And you can also download each state's data. So you can download all the state's different line items that we pulled and how we've categorized and then how we've analyzed it. So we really want this information to be used and picked through. So I want to pause here just to say that building strong partnerships with administrators and advocates in every state is really how we make sure that this tool is as accurate and as useful as possible. So if you or somebody that you know is a budget expert in a particular state or city, please reach out. We would love to partner with you. And yes, as Sessy mentioned, we'll be releasing some new briefs and hosting some additional webinars based on this material, because there's a lot more than we haven't even shown you yet for this project. So please stay tuned for those this winter. One will be really geared towards how advocates can use this data with their legislators. And then another one will really dive much deeper into just how reliant state funding systems are on federal programs. So I have to say thank you to the members of our Shortchanged Project Advisory Committee and to the Heising Simons Foundation and the Salzans Charitable Foundation for just their amazing support in helping us bring this project to life. This has been a long-held dream of our executive director, Teresa Holly's. So we made it happen, and we couldn't have done it without you. And we also could not have done it without the example that and data that NIEER State of Babies project has really spearheaded for us. So with that, I will let Allison tell you about all of the work, really interesting work that the State of Preschool has uncovered and the great lengths that they have to go through in order to do so. So Allison, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me go ahead and share my screen and get started. Look okay? Okay, well, thank you. So now I'm gonna switch gears from talking about all these different early childhood education, early childhood funding streams to focus on just state-funded preschool programs. So that's one of the programs that was in the Shortchanged report. Funding for state-funded preschool comes mainly from the states, but as I'll talk about, it also does include local and federal funding. So it's, I can't imagine how complicated it is to look at all these different funding streams when just looking at state-funded preschool funding streams can get pretty complicated too. NIEER has a very specific definition of what a state-funded preschool program is, and our report is intended to be narrowly focused on that program, intentionally to be a tool for advocates, for policymakers, for researchers, looking specifically at state-funded preschool program. So we define state-funded preschool as a program that is funded, controlled, and directed primarily by the state that serves predominantly 3 and 4-year-olds in a group learning setting for at least 2 days a week, The focus of the program is early childhood education, though it may have other roles like helping parents get jobs, things like that, but it is the primary focus is early childhood education. The program can be coordinated and integrated with the state's childcare system, but it is also distinct and it's not the same thing. So in some cases, our state-funded preschool program is sort of like a childcare model, but it often isn't. The programs also are not designed solely to serve children with disabilities, though every state-funded preschool program that we include in our report does include children with disabilities in various ways. And we also do include state supplemental programs, or at least some of them, state supplemental Head Start programs in our definition of state-funded preschool program and in our report. We spent a full year collecting data on just this one early childhood program. So again, it must have been a huge lift to collect all the information across all these different programs. NIEER has been doing this for a long time, for more than 20 years before my time at NIEER. The first State of Preschool report was published in 2003 and focuses on the 2001-2002 school year. So at this point, we're approaching having 25 years of data on state-funded preschool program. The initial years of the yearbook were funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, who had a 10-year investment in state-funded preschool. They funded NIEER. They really were instrumental in launching NIEER, and they funded an advocacy organization called Pre-K Now at the same time. And the two research and advocacy organizations worked together and really were very impactful, using the State of Preschool Yearbook as one of the many tools. And I know there's people on here who are very familiar with what happened back then. And so the yearbook was developed at the time to be the only report to track enrollment in spending on and quality standards of state-funded preschool programs nationally. It was from the beginning and still is intended to be a product that's co-constructed with state preschool administrators. So we really value the input of the people who are giving us their data. So as Michelle said, it's about those relationships with the people who are giving you the data and also using the data. We often lean on them to pilot new questions, to ask where we can improve the process, how to make it a more useful tool. That's like a very important part of the report for us and the whole process. The data in the book, it has many uses. It's intended to be an advocacy tool. It's intended to be a tool for policymakers to use to improve access to quality preschool in their states. It's also a valuable tool for researchers. We do a big push to get it out to the media, and so that it can be used for advocacy purposes and for lots of different purposes. We know both anecdotally and from the data that the report has had impact on moving state-funded preschool policies forward and increasing access. I'll talk about the data a little bit later, but anecdotally, we know that there are states that, like Michigan, for example, that has written many of the yearbooks quality standard benchmarks into their program code for their preschool programs. Alabama is a state that, they have a whole campaign about how they've been meeting all 10 of NIEER's quality standard benchmarks for almost 20 years. I think this year will be year 20. That's something that they, like the advocates, the policymakers in the state, they proudly tout that. And then we've also heard from states that don't have a preschool program at all, that maybe not proudly, but they hang up in their offices that program, that profile page that says no program, as an incentive to try to change that. In terms of impact to when we started this in 2002, there were 45 state-funded preschool programs in 38 states and the District of Columbia. In last year's report, there were 64 programs in 44 states and DC, plus another program in Guam and a pre-K-like program in Indiana. So we've changed a lot about the yearbook over time, what it looks like, the questions that we ask, how we ask the questions, but the goal to move policy forward and increase access for state-funded preschool has remained the same. Since those initial 10 years of the Pew funding for the report has been funded by various sources, including federal funding through NCES for a few years, and now through the Heising-Simons Foundation and the Gates Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with this report, and I think a lot of people are familiar, so I'll walk through this pretty quickly. I'm going to walk through some sections of the report, and starting with the executive summary, where we summarize the findings, highlight key themes for the year. The executive summary includes lots of figures and maps to show both trends over time and variation across the states. It also includes the national profile page where we highlight the access or enrollment and spending, as well as our quality standards. There's a set of tables at the end of the executive summary that summarizes state by state and nationally enrollment, quality, and spending. We outline what's in our quality standard benchmarks, describe them, provide research base for them, as well as describe the components of our state profile pages in this roadmap section. It also includes definitions of key terms and a glossary. Oh, I'm sorry. Then we have our set of state profile pages. The first page includes sort of a qualitative narrative to explain more background on the context of what's going on in the state and the nuances of our state-funded preschool program that maybe don't make it into the data itself or explain the data. There's two sets of graphs, one that show changes in enrollment over time and the other that shows the changes in spending per child. There's a set of rankings at the bottom of the page. And then on the second page, it looks similar to that national page where we go through access, quality standards, and enrollment for each state. For states with more than one program, this repeats for each program within the state. There's a methodology section at the end that often gets overlooked, but it explains how we've collected the data, our data sources, our analysis plan. And then finally, at the end, we have the appendices. Appendix A is a wealth of information. It contains the answers to every question we ask with detailed footnotes in many cases. It's available in a PDF form, but we're always happy to provide it in an Excel file too for people who actually want to use it in more of an analytical manner. There's also data on Head Start, early childhood special education, and the census data. So how do we get to that point of having a report? So I like to think about the yearbook as a cycle because the work really never ends. We're often working on finishing up one report and then starting on the next report. So it's this year-round effort. We start, so to speak, in the spring each year by updating our survey, which includes fixing questions that maybe weren't super clear the year before, deciding what topics we're going to add or take away, writing new questions and piloting new questions. I'm always trying to delete questions because I know the survey gets so long and it's a huge burden on the states. We're often around 200 to 300 questions, and we want to add more. It's like a struggle every year. Over the summer, we then program our survey into our web-based platform and test it a lot before we send it out to states at the end of the summer. When states get their survey link, each state gets their own link to the survey, each program, in fact, and we pre-populate that data, their survey. So we include their answers to last year's questions in the survey they get, so they can hopefully more easily answer the questions. They can remember, okay, this is how I said last year, nothing's changed, click. We did that to really help reduce the burden a little bit. We give the states about a month to respond to the program, though really most states ask for more time, and we're always very accommodating with that. Once we get the surveys in, we start reviewing them. We review every answer very carefully. We compare it to the answers we got the year before. We make sure everything in the survey is consistent internally, because sometimes the states will say one thing in one area and something else that doesn't make sense together. We send questions back to the states. We have conversations to really make sure we're getting the data as accurate as possible, that we understand it the best that we can. Once we have our sort of clean and final data, we start doing the analysis, which is my favorite part of the yearbook process. We do have several times throughout the process where states get to review their responses and make sure that we interpreted everything right. Up until the very end, like a week or so before the report, they get an embargoed copy of their profile page and a state press release that will go out, and they can review it one more time. We brief them as well before the report gets released. Once the report is out, we finalize that Appendix A, because that always just takes more time. And then at the same time as that, we're starting to develop the new survey. There's more behind it. It's a huge process. We've got a great team that works on it. We're always sort of a year behind. So right now, when we're in the 25-26 school year, we're working on the report that focuses on the 24-25 school year. We do a key part of our State of Preschool yearbook are the rankings, and we rank on 4 metrics. This was intended to sort of be a horse race to pit states against each other to help them compete to improve their rankings. Particularly when we started the yearbook, we would try to compare states to their neighbors because we know, for example, that Mississippi really does care about what Alabama is doing, probably more so than they care about what California is doing. The first 2 rankings are about access. So enrollment, we calculate the percentage of all 4-year-olds in the state that are enrolled in preschool, the percentage of all 3-year-olds in the state that are enrolled in preschool. And then our resource ranking is about spending per child. The first one is the amount of dollars the state invests per child. And then the second one is our all reported spending metric. And this is where we add in local and federal dollars that the states can report. But as Michelle was talking about, they can't always report it. So there's likely, for most states, this is an underestimate of all the funding that is going into preschool. It's the best that they can report. For some states, they can't report anything other than the state dollars. For other states, this all reported spending metric is a better accounting of the program, of the funding for their program, because they really are blending and braiding state, local, and federal dollars to support their programs. And for all the rankings, the highest or the best state gets ranked number 1. And in our case, for the last several years, DC has ranked first on all 4 of these metrics. We all have also have our 10 quality standard benchmarks that NIEER assesses the preschool policies against. These are what we consider the minimum standards for quality. They're research-based. We think this is the minimum that programs need to have a quality program, though it does not guarantee quality. And many programs go above and beyond these. We don't measure implementation. So if a state says that the class size maximum is 20, we're basing our assessment of the benchmark on that policy, not by collecting data on the number of children actually per classroom. We're hoping to start delving into some of that in the future. So stay tuned for those changes. And then what you can also see on this slide is the number of programs last year that met each of the benchmarks. So certain things like the early learning and development standards, nearly every program is meeting that benchmark. But then the staff professional development, assistant teachers, having a CDA, those are much harder for programs to meet. We really are seeing not enough states meeting enough benchmarks. In general, we've seen states moving in the wrong direction in terms of quality in the last few years, where programs are lowering quality standards rather than raising them. However, we do have 5 states, Alabama, Hawaii, Michigan, Mississippi, and Rhode Island, meeting all 10 of our quality standard benchmarks. Those are the darkest green states on the map. Next year, we believe that Georgia will join that group and will be the largest program to meet at least 10 benchmarks. There are 18 programs overall that meet 9 or 10 benchmarks. 21 programs meet 5 or fewer. There are a lot more kids in those 21 programs meeting 5 or fewer benchmarks. You can see those darker red, darker orange states on the map. You have Texas, California, and Florida in that bucket of meeting fewer benchmarks. We do see some improvement over the last 10 years. So this light blue bar representing the percentage of programs meeting 9 or 10 benchmarks has been increasing. On the other hand, the percentage meeting 5 or fewer benchmarks has not been decreasing. I'm going to talk now about some of the highlights from last year's report. States set new records for preschool enrollment and for spending during the 23-24 school year. Nationally, we reached record highs in enrollment, both in terms of the number of children and the percentage of children enrolled, and that's important because the number of children in many states is decreasing. States enrolled more than 1.75 million children, which was an increase of over 100,000 children. Nationally, we reached 37% of 4-year-olds and 8% of 3-year-olds. As you can see here, nationally, pre-K enrollment has rebounded from pre-pandemic highs, so we're above that point in 2019. However, much of this progress was driven by just a few states making huge leaps, like Colorado and California, that each added over 30,000 new slots last year. Those two states alone accounted for 60% of the national enrollment increase. There were 9 other states that increased by more than 20%. There's 5 states that continue not to fund a state-funded preschool program: Idaho, Montana, New Hampshire, South Dakota, and Wyoming. And while nearly all states did increase enrollment between the 23 and 24 school years, many states are still serving fewer kids than before the pandemic started. And additionally, over the last 20-something years, we do see growth in the percentage of 4-year-olds enrolled, but we don't see that same movement for 3-year-olds. We're still below 10% of 3-year-olds. As I've mentioned, there's substantial variation across the states in enrollment of 4-year-olds. The darker green states are serving the highest percentage of children. DC enrolled 94% of 4-year-olds, followed by Vermont at 76%. There are 10 other states that enrolled more than 50% of 4-year-olds. Now switching to 3-year-olds, these two maps use the same color scheme, and you can see this one is a lot redder, which isn't surprising given the national average. Most states serve only a fraction of 3-year-olds. Vermont and DC stand out, enrolling 85% in DC and 58% in Vermont. There's a few other states in like that yellow color that are serving 20% of 3-year-olds. New Mexico made a huge increase last year in its push towards universal preschool in the increase in enrollment in 3-year-olds. So it'll be interesting to see if that progress keeps going. Turning to spending now, states also reached record highs in spending on preschool last year, spending more than $13.6 billion in state dollars, a $2 billion increase. That reaches $15.3 billion when you include those local and federal dollars. Most states did increase spending. Several states increased by more than $100 million. And those 6 states, California, Colorado, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, New Mexico, and Texas, which is actually 7 states, accounted for 3/4 of the national increase in spending. We don't know if this is momentum is going to be maintained. We're a little bit nervous that we're going to see a different trend starting soon. Many states use federal COVID relief funds to support preschool over the last few years, and that's really no longer available. Plus, all the other federal funding cuts are putting states in tough decisions about how to spend their money, and whether or not they're going to be able to maintain this level of funding on preschool is something we will find out over the next few years. Spending per child, while it did reach another all-time high of almost $8,000 last year with a large increase, it's still not where we want it to be. It's still only about $1,000 higher than it was adjusted for inflation over 20 years ago, which is not high enough to fund a quality program with salary parity for teachers. There's, I put together a list of like the top 5 spenders, a few different metrics: total spending, spending per child, increases in spending. Not surprisingly, California, Texas in the top spending. They're huge states serving a lot of children, but California is also, spending a lot per child. New Mexico had a very large increase per child this year as they moved towards universal preschool for all children. California also a huge increase in spending, as well as Colorado. Both of them are moving towards universal through their different programs. We also looked across the states at how much it would cost to provide high quality preschool per child. This map shows the gap between what states are spending and what they would need to spend. So the dark green states are the states that are we estimate to be spending enough. The darkest red and orange, those states need to spend more than double what they're spending now to really adequately fund a quality preschool program. Right now, it varies by about $20,000 per child between the highest and the lowest spending states. And again, some of these estimates might be underestimates, since not all states can fully report the local and federal share. So like in the Shortchanged report, even a full accounting of pre-K spending is challenging for many states to provide. And then lastly, I wanted to show, like in the Shortchanged report, that investments in both state pre-K and Head Start lag behind what is spent in K-12. So this shows the national picture where K-12 is more than $10,000 more than pre-K. It does vary a bit state to state, but in no state does pre-K spending surpass K-12 spending. And with that, I would say thank you to everyone. Feel free to check out our report, email me with any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Allison and Michelle. So much information and data. I know we have a couple of comments in the chat. And so I think I'm just going to reflect really quickly, and then we're going to go to some questions. The first thing that strikes me is, especially in Allison, your map, and we found this in the Shortchanged project, the incredible variability state to state, right? And that the data doesn't tell the whole picture, right? I mean, I think we have a question in the chat that kind of speaks to, but how do we get that full picture of quality and the families that need both childcare and a preschool experience? And that just gets harder and harder and harder the more that, that we want to know. So I think one is that variability. The other thing is that I think, and I kind of alluded to this at the beginning, 2003 was an instrumental year in Illinois, where I have been for all of my career in early care and education. And it was the first year that the NIEER, the state report card came out. And that was a year that we had a new governor in Illinois who had a preschool age child and got the importance and the need for preschool, high quality preschool. He said that what my daughter has, every 3 and 4 year old should have. So we started a trajectory of making significant investments. We already had a good foundation. We were one of the original pre-K now states. And so was part of that project in the beginning. So 2003 was a big year already in Illinois. We were doing a lot on our childcare side. We were making first time investments over many years in preschool. And then we had the report card came out. And this was the kind of a game changer in early care and education, because we were kind of like soft and fuzzy people, and suddenly we had this report card where we're just going to like give you a grade, like we're just going to call a spade a spade. And Illinois, actually, I went back and revisited the report that came out then. And for 4-year-olds, in terms of how Illinois was doing, we were 8th. So we were pretty good. And for 3-year-olds, because we have an early childhood block grant that is a birth to 5 funding stream through our State Board of Education, we were 4th. So we were pretty good. 20 some years later, we're 20th in serving 4-year-olds. And we're 3rd in serving 3-year-olds, right? And so I would think that we have continued to make incredible investments and contributions to early care and education. We continue to have bipartisan support for children birth to 5 in our system. And yet, right, to Adele's comment, like really dollar for dollar, we have not really done right by kids, even in the best of states. I mean, we have a few outliers. So I think in terms of preschool and overall that we are falling behind, right? For all the efforts. And for those of us who have been in this for a really long time, you're like, good Lord, what have I accomplished? It can get a little sobering sometimes, but I think this is the other trend that I would say overall that we see across the country is the need for data and the kind of people wanting some much more concrete data for our systems that fund children birth to 5, like we've had in our K through 12. And I think that the NIEER report was kind of a game changer again in terms of moving us in that direction. And I think the ELLO project that Build put out that we built upon with our Shortchanged project was another milestone in early care and education, and really trying to get at what that data tells us, right, in terms of how are we doing by kids. So those are some of my initial reflections. I think with the Shortchanged, I think the other overarching reflection is the incredible need to, much like the comment, we need to start putting all of the different services together that fund children birth to 5 so that we have that full picture from an equity perspective. I think that we always want to increasingly and need to be able to look at a per child, but per classroom, per program, per system, per age, understand what the investments are from all the different directions in our incredibly fractured system, right? The system is the system. But how we respond in terms of a data collection, analysis, and use of that data is on us as advocates, as researchers. And so I think both of these projects are so instrumental in moving us towards being able to equitably say across the country, how are we doing? In a state, how are we doing? And how do we do better? And where is the inequity, right? I think the one of the things that was most shocking to me and most interesting is that mountain slide or iceberg slide, is the difference, incredible investments being made in some states in their preschool programs and yet lagging significantly behind in their babies, right? I always, when we talk about birth to three, I think about Joan Lombardi, who was one of my mentors and teachers, and she always told us to talk about the babies. Never forget the babies and how we think about building a system. So those are some of my initial reflections. I'm super excited for both having the big picture and the digging down into the preschool and what we've been able to kind of expand upon, and the work that this kind of sets us forth and able to do going forward. I think Sarah's going to ask us some couple of questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sessy. We do have some questions prepared, but as Sessy mentioned earlier, if you do have a question, please put it in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll try to leave a couple minutes at the end for audience questions. So first off, what surprised you the most when doing the latest analysis for each of your projects? Michelle, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Allison and Sessy.
Yeah, I mean, so my big picture reflection is really, and Sarah, you've been with me pretty much every step of the way here, but just how hard it is to actually get your hands on expenditure data at the state level. Our executive director, Teresa Hawley, is kind of famous for saying, how hard could it be? Which is the mentality that we started this project with. And in Illinois, which is the state we're most familiar with, they do have a relatively comprehensive public-facing expenditure tool that you can filter by program. So we sort of started there and thought, well, clearly most states must have that. And boy, were we wrong. So I think, the biggest picture reflection I have, or the surprise, was just how little transparency there is around how much states spend on early childhood. And, for that is for good reason, but it's also makes a project like this really complicated and makes the relationships that you have to build that much more important. And then, I think there were some particular surprises around which states were investing where, which really stood out. Like I mentioned Missouri in the presentation, but they spend a huge amount on pre-K special education services, which was a surprise. That's a pretty underreported story. And then, as Sessy mentioned too, that just the amount of variation across states in terms of how much they're spending per age group. And that was just the mountain graph was really very surprising for, I think, our whole team.
Before I talk about the surprises, I will just clarify that for the yearbook, we also focus on getting expenditures from states rather than allocations. It is difficult. It's difficult for states to report that information even a year later.
Yeah, and that's why we're able to lean on you guys so hard in our analysis. So we appreciate it.
But then in terms of surprise, I think last year, the growth we saw in state-funded preschool, and both in enrollment and spending, was really sort of surprising and larger than we've seen in a really long time, both for enrollment, adding more children, and the spending. In retrospect, maybe less surprising because of these pushes for universal, with Colorado and California in particular leading the way, and New Mexico. So we were happily surprised to find that last year. I don't think we're going to have such a positive picture this spring. I could be wrong. But yeah, that was probably the most surprising thing we found last year.
Yeah. And I'll just jump in and I think I already alluded to when both of you said, the variability, I am pleasantly surprised and also cautious about what the future holds. that I know we've seen this in Illinois in terms of overarching or overall enrollment is really back up and even exceeds where we were pre-COVID, right? I mean, that was such a monumental disruptor to our system and to families and to communities and funding and everything. And so I do think, given how monumental it was, that we've seen that enrollment come back up. And so that I'm glad about that. And I think the overarching and disappointment then would be that we just really aren't making the progress in terms of the investment. I think the not necessarily a surprise, but we always knew when different reports would come out and it said Illinois spends this. It's like, no, it wasn't it wasn't tracking our expenditure. It was really tracking our appropriations, our allocations. And so it's so kind of, I don't know if rewarding is the right word, but I'm so glad that we're getting closer to having more concrete and accurate data and calling it what it is, right? I think allocations are a really important data point, but it is a different data point than expenditure, right? And so I'm just so thrilled that we're moving forward. And I think that is one of, and I'm going to answer a question that's coming later, which is a trend, which is I think more and more states are recognizing the need and putting systems in place that are getting some better data systems so we can answer these questions.
Perfect transition.
Oh, go ahead.
That perfect transition.
You alluded to the next question perfectly. So Sessy and then Allison, what trends are you seeing in state and local ECE investments?
I'll let Allison go because I feel like I already answered my question.
Okay.
I don't want to take time.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it's harder to track the local funding trends because, as I mentioned, what we get is not a complete a complete picture, and we haven't really focused on looking at, for example, just local spending over time. But we're seeing states invest more money in preschool. We saw a lot of states, almost all states used COVID relief funding over the last few years in order to supplement, increase, improve. Some of these states have plans to sustain that, and some of the plans are not as concrete. And so we're going to see what that looks like over the next few years. Another thing we've seen is that some of our sort of longstanding universal states are not really universal, and they're in fact decreasing enrollment. So in some places that may be because of lower investments or not being able to sustain the investments. In some places, we're not really sure why this is happening. It's not happening in all the universal states. So that's sort of this interesting question we're facing right now. Why aren't the kids going in some of these places?
Yeah. And the other thing I'll say is, in terms of a trend, is, and we've worked in about 10 states at CELFE doing consulting on various aspects of their early care and education system. The best work that we do is always when we're able to look at the entire system and really think about it comprehensively. But I do think that I don't know if this is a trend, but what we've seen in some places is that states are really interested from their public school perspective, thinking about how do they increase access to preschool, right? And even some states that we've looked into around looking at the mechanisms by which they fund their pre-K programs and how they get those money out and how they distribute those dollars to community-based versus schools. I think it's exciting that we have the opportunity to expand preschool in public school buildings. I think it is on us to then think about how does that impact our community-based providers and how do we elevate infants and toddlers in that conversation as we think about expanding preschool, right? We've done that structurally in Illinois by having a birth to 5 funding stream that has a set aside for babies and toddlers. It is not the same as what we put into the preschool, but I do think that as we see kind of, and you mentioned that in some of the places in the states you see fewer children, and so looking at the number of children, not just the percentage of children, becomes important, right? As we look at some depopulating states, that impacts not just early care and education, but their K through 12 funding system. And so how do we make sure that resources are redirected if they're not needed for third grade, how do we make sure those resources are redirected for preschool? And then at the same time, how do we as a field really think about that, working with our community-based programs, elevating babies and toddlers, and making sure that we really are creating opportunities for preschool for working families in every community. So I think that it's kind of a watershed moment in this time, to really think differently about how we move forward as a system.
Yeah, Steve Barnett's been talking a lot about that too, about how, we're in states with declining or districts with declining populations, like rather than having to close a school, now you have space and funding to add a grade level, to add 2 grade levels for 3 and 4-year-olds. And we are doing some work in New Jersey right now about the infant and toddler issues as well, to look at, since New Jersey is, at least in theory, expanding their preschool program, to see how the gradual rollout of preschool is impacting access to childcare for infants and toddlers in the state. So stay tuned for that next year.
All right. Well, both of you kind of answered my next question about where the field of ECE needs to go next. So Michelle and Allison, can you each share what's next for Shortchanged and the State of Preschool projects? Allison, we'll start with you.
Sure. So the 2 biggest changes to the yearbook that we will be embarking on soon is we're going to be redoing our benchmarks again over the course of the next year. We're going to be entering into conversations with states and some other stakeholders about which benchmarks to change, if we're going to just strengthen some of them, going back to the research to really see how we should make those changes, and also engaging with the states in those conversations. And the other thing we're hoping to do is what we're sort of calling the 4th pillar. And so if you think about our access, spending, and quality are the first 3 pillars of the yearbook, this 4th pillar is going to really dive into actual data, what's actually happening in those programs. So if trying to get states, we're going to pilot this with a few states to say, okay, what kind of data can you give us on that sort of backs up the benchmark? So average class sizes, ratios, teacher degree, what curriculum is being used, what kind of assessments are being used, and then also tying that to then child outcome data that they have both maybe in preschool, but also later on. So this is what we are envisioning as this 4th pillar. We're going to start by piloting it, but it's really exciting because we've always only had policy data for the most part, and so we're interested to see if we can make this happen. And then again, the rest of it we're going to keep doing for as long as we can to keep tracking our sort of typical metrics.
Yeah, so we already mentioned we've got additional webinars and research policy briefs that will be coming out this winter with the data that we've already collected. And then we also need to hit the ground running in January with collecting data for FY23 and hopefully FY24 so that we can start to catch up. The reason that we're stuck in FY22 is because that's the most recent federal data that's available to us across all the different federal funding streams that we're evaluating, but we really do, when we talk to the states, FY22 feels like, a decade ago. So we really do want to move at a faster clip now. And then, we also, as we develop partnerships within states, we really want to dig a little bit deeper into the context of how their state funding systems operate and why, a state like Missouri is spending so much on preschool special education, compared to other states. So that we know is all social and political context and historical context. So we want to be able to share that with you so that states can really learn from one another and adapt as need be. And then we also, as Allison has mentioned, we know there's a lot of really amazing innovation that's happening at the city and county level. We certainly are not so delusional that we think we'll be able to capture all of that, but we hope to sort of start dipping our toes into some case studies of particularly innovative cities and counties as well. And that'll be, well into the future. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, I think we're out of time, so apologies. This has been hopefully as interesting and rewarding for our audience as it has been for us as we uncover this. Allison and our colleagues at NIEER, thank you so much for joining us today, for the work you do, for the partnership, and we're super excited. And thank you to our advisory who has really helped guide us from the very beginning, and some of those partners, have co-hosted with us. The Alliance for Early Success, the Children's Funding Project. They've been on previous versions of this that helped us get here today. So thank you all for those partnerships. We're super excited for what the next year brings in terms of really digging into this data and bringing, tearing it apart. And bringing you it in digestible pieces, in usable ways. So in January, we'll get a date out soon in terms of as state legislatures go back into session, really thinking about how does this data serve as an advocacy tool for where you are in the country. And then, of course, as we look to the president's budget in early February, really thinking about the impact of federal funding on states and how that either shores up or makes vulnerable services to children and families. So thank you all so much for the work you do wherever you are. Happy holidays for whatever you celebrate. And I think that wraps us up. Thanks, everybody. See you in 2026.